This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history.
Episode 14. Traitors in Our Midst. John glanced down at the hand of cards he'd been dealt, rubbing his chin in thought. The game was somewhat effective in making the time go by faster, even as his eyes burned for want of sleep. Morning light was seeping through the branches of the massive tulip tree above them, its gnarled limbs creating strange, warped shadows over the earth. He was grateful for his thick Hessian coat that protected him from the September morning chill. It was rather strange for a patriot to be wearing such a thing, but they were in dangerous territory, never sure if they would meet a friend or a foe. In fact, he'd been captured this very year, not far from where they now were, and was then held by enemy forces in North Dutch Church in Manhattan, before he managed to escape. And here he was, having found himself free for only 4 days back near Tarrytown. John shifted, never sitting with his back turned from the road, though he knew his ears would detect anyone approaching. They'd selected this spot near the little stream that locals called Clark's Kill, after they'd split from the other 4 members of their party. John still felt ill thinking about the farmer who'd been murdered and his possessions stolen. Helm was the man's name. Well, if any of the Tories who'd committed the atrocity came around, they'd be waiting for them. One of the British officers who'd taken part had already been apprehended. Now they just hoped to find the rest, and maybe even recover some of the stolen goods. John still remembered all too well when the British had pillaged his father's land and harassed his mother. While he was unable to prevent that misdeed, he hoped he might in a way help to right this one. His 2 comrades, David and Isaac, were observing their own cards. David massaged the back of his neck as Isaac took his turn. Both were much like John himself, raised in families that farmed as tenants on Philip's Manor before the war, working the land since their birth and barely more than boys when the war had broken out. Isaac was still a little wet behind the ears, barely 20 years old, but John had to admit that wasn't much younger than his own 22 years. Though at over 6 feet tall with his strong build, he likely looked older. But David claimed the place of eldest at 25. All 3 of them had done sporadic military service during the war. The faint sound of pounding hooves suddenly assaulted John's senses. His hand shot toward his musket. Springing to his feet, John saw Isaac and David do the same. Eyes squinting, John watched the rider drawing near. He'd half expected to spot the red coat of a Tory, but if this man was a British officer, he wasn't dressed like one. Still, as he drew close, John, David, and Isaac emerged from their hiding place in the brush, raising their muskets and stopping the man's progress. The man drew his horse in, his face flushed and his expression clearly annoyed by the interruption. He must have been close to 30 years old, his features handsome and his build slim. He eyed them shrewdly, saying in a haughty tone, "I hope, gentlemen, you belong to the lower party. I am a British officer on business of importance and must not be detained." John, William, and David exchanged a look. "We're not from the lower party," John explained. "We're patriots. And as such, we'd like to know just what business you are about, sir." The man's eyes flashed with the briefest moment of surprise. "Ah, yes, I'm so relieved to hear you say that. One can never be too careful. My name is John Anderson." He reached into his pocket, procuring a card and extending it toward them. John took the paper from his outstretched hand, keeping his musket cradled in his left arm. David and Isaac watched him rather than the paper. None of them had received formal schooling, and of the 3, John was the only one that could read. The paper did indeed identify the man as John Anderson, a New York businessman. The scrawled words on the parchment read, "Permit Mr. John Anderson to pass the guards, to the White Plains or below if he chooses, he being on public business by my direction." It was signed, General Arnold. John looked up in surprise, feeling somewhat impressed. He of course knew who General Arnold was. He was well known as one of the best field generals in the Continental Army. "We have to be careful, sir," John apologized. "There are bad people all around here, Tories and traitors and such. Please, don't be offended." The man smiled amicably, his features relaxing a little. Of course not. He turned back to his horse, placing a foot in the stirrup and mounting again. He appeared anxious to continue on his journey, but John hesitated. Something about this encounter seemed off. He'd had more than his fair share of dealings with the British between the 2 times he'd been captured, and his instincts were telling him that something was wrong. "Not yet, sir," John said, as he motioned to David and Isaac. "Just a routine check, if you don't mind." "I don't have time for this. I really must be on my way." John sent the man an unyielding look, face stone, as he again gestured Isaac and David forward. They led the complaining John Anderson to the woods, yanking off his coat and shirt, then searching his pockets. His boots and pants were also pulled off and searched. They found nothing. John Anderson sat on a nearby log, fuming and irritated. He leaned forward to retrieve his boots. "Now your stockings," John demanded. The man's eyes fell to his woolen, knee-length socks, making no move to reach and remove them. John nodded to Isaac and David, who knelt down to pull them off. From the bottom of each fell a small sheaf of folded paper. John snatched them up from the ground, unfolding the crumpled sheets and quickly scanning them. It became swiftly apparent that they contained information regarding the numbers and disposition of the men and guns at West Point, a critical fortification on the west bank of the Hudson River. Each was signed by Benedict Arnold. "Dress him and tie him up," John barked, as he compared the signatures on the papers with the pass. "This man is a spy." If you've ever worked around trains, you're familiar with the concept of switch points, or turnouts. A switch point is a movable piece of rail that allows a train to change direction without having to stop. They're typically controlled by a switch key. And I've always been intrigued with the idea that the slightest movement of rail can lead to such a drastic change of destination. And I've found that time works much the same way. It doesn't slow down, but it does meet switch points that take it another direction. So when we look back and observe, we find that small movements or choices might determine the course of our lives, sometimes the fate of families, or even the fate of nations. There is no such thing as an insignificant choice. Like a drop in a bucket, they slowly contribute to who we will eventually become. Though I admit that some choices may prove more critical than others. But it probably won't be until we look back at the end of our lives that we realize which choices prove to be the most pivotal. It's for this very reason that history is so valuable. You're able to see the full span of choices and their consequences. And I find that incredibly compelling. God may in His wisdom direct our paths, but we make the choices, and ultimately hold the switch key that decides the end result of the person we will be. In the previous episode, I explained a series of miracles that saved America during the Civil War. This episode is in a way a part 2 of that episode. We're going to talk about another miracle of equal magnitude, but earlier in American history. And like those that I related in episode 13, the significance of this is little known or understood. So buckle in and let's dive into some obscure history. First, you need to become familiar with an important figure. You'll likely know his name. Unlike many of the characters that we've discussed, he is not famous for his commitment, valor, or good deeds. On the contrary, his name is shrouded in infamy. He is remembered primarily as a turncoat, a traitor. His name is Benedict Arnold. He is undoubtedly the most famous defector in American history. But why is that? What made his treachery so monumental that it set him above the rest? A child learns at a young age that the higher they climb on the stairs, the greater the pain when they fall. Benedict Arnold is so despised because he had ascended to a place of such authority and trust that great pain was inflicted when he departed from it. But I'm not here to tear down Benedict Arnold or to paint him out as an evil, treacherous leech. But I do intend to show you how gradual the path to betrayal really is, and how small choices can lead you down a path that you never imagined you would go. And alongside that, to tell you of a miracle that needs to be brought to the public view. Because there is so much more to Arnold's betrayal than people realize. But before we get into that, let me just give you a little bit of a background on Benedict Arnold. Because even though he's a widely recognized figure, he still is very little known. Benedict Arnold descended from strong and proud American stock. His great-grandfather was actually one of the founders of Rhode Island. His father was a sea captain and a successful merchant. By nature, Arnold was brave, boisterous, and a natural leader. Even as a child, he had a strong sense of honor and dignity, and a hot temper that frequently got him into fights. But he also had a heart for the underdog, and was known to jump to the defense of the younger and weaker boys. But when he was 12 years old, he lost two of his sisters to illness. The tragedy broke his father, and he began heavily drinking. This affected his father's business and landed the family in bankruptcy. Unable to afford Arnold's private school anymore, Arnold was forced to return home, only to find people spreading gossip about his family. It was incredibly humiliating, and brought great shame to the family's good name. I've told you this because it's absolutely critical to understanding Benedict Arnold. He would be motivated by a pursuit of honor the rest of his life. He was only 34 when the Revolutionary War officially started, and after his betrayal, many tried to paint him out to be this conniving devil from the start. But the truth is far more disturbing. Benedict Arnold was originally one of the greatest advocates of the American cause. After the Boston Massacre, one of the signaling events of the Revolution, he cried out, "Are all Americans asleep and giving up their glorious liberties?" Arnold actually began the war as a volunteer, and in 1775 he was elected the captain of a militia company. During the Battle of Quebec, he led his men through frigid temperatures and was wounded in the leg. While the battle was a defeat, his superiors were impressed by Arnold's perseverance in the midst of adversity, including Washington. In fact, throughout the war, Arnold would become one of Washington's favorite and most trusted generals. When Arnold was passed over for promotion, as he was several times, Washington petitioned Congress to reconsider, saying that there was no more active, spirited, nor sensible officer in the army. But it did not change their minds. Eventually, Arnold was promoted to Major General, but he was now junior to the other officers promoted before him. This hurt his pride, but a greater blow was yet to come. In September of 1777, during the Battle of Saratoga, Arnold sustained a terrible injury in his leg, the same leg where he'd been wounded at Quebec. The wound would be both painful and debilitating. He spent several miserable months recovering in a Patriot military hospital. The injury was so painful that he remarked to another soldier that he wished the bullet had just gone through his heart. During those long months, he had plenty of time to brood over how Congress had slighted him for promotion. He thought of the successful career that he'd sacrificed, and the funds that he'd contributed, which Congress was in no place to reimburse him for. To add insult to injury, Horatio Gates was credited for the victory at Saratoga, which again infuriated Arnold. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't something to these slights. There was. But Arnold's hot temper and ego would lead to frequent fights and disagreements with other soldiers throughout his military career. And there was another vice that contributed to Arnold's downfall. He had a taste for lavish living. After his injury, he became military commander of Philadelphia. This was shortly after the British had left their occupation of the city, and Philadelphia was greatly divided, having a range from extreme patriots to staunch loyalists. The wealthy especially tended to have a loyalist leaning, having prospered under British occupation. And Arnold wanted to be accepted in Philadelphia's high society. So he took up residence in a large stately home, frequently holding extravagant parties and attending the theater. This behavior earned him suspicion from the patriots in the city. And it was during this time that he made the acquaintance of a beautiful young woman named Margaret, or Peggy, Shippen. Another switch point. Peggy was only 18 when she met Arnold, and came from a very wealthy family with loyalist sympathies. Her father finally agreed to the marriage, but Arnold struggled to afford the lavish lifestyle that Peggy was accustomed to, and he was driven into deep debt trying to. This led him to abuse his position and try and boost his finances. And while he didn't necessarily do anything illegal, his actions were certainly ethically questionable. Congress ordered a court-martial, but in the end, most of the charges were dropped, and Washington, under threat of losing Philadelphia's support in the war, had no choice but to issue a stern reprimand. Arnold was outraged. This was the last straw. He felt Washington, too, had turned against him. Peggy only stoked the fire of her husband's grievances, and all loyalty and love that he'd felt for the American cause and its commander, George Washington, became obscured by wounded pride and bitter feelings. On top of that, his finances were in a state of ruin. Peggy's spending drove him into deep debt. And it was through his wife that Arnold met the young and dashing John Andre, an adjutant general in the British Army and head of British intelligence. He began a correspondence with Andre, offering his services in return for £10,000, about $4 million in today's equivalent, and a British military commission. Andre accepted on one condition, that Arnold hand the crucial American fort at West Point to the British. Gaining West Point would have fulfilled the British's long-held hopes of commanding the Hudson River, thus cutting the 13 American states in half. Around this time, George Washington reached out to Arnold, offering him a new and lofty position, control of the entire left wing of the Continental Army, making him his number 3 general. Months earlier, it would have been an offer Arnold would have jumped at, but it was too late. His treasonous plot was already in motion. Instead, he asked for the command of West Point. Washington was surprised when he received Arnold's request. It seemed like a tame position for a man who reveled in being where the action was. But as a personal favor, he acquiesced. Arnold not only agreed to give West Point to the British, but offered an added lure, the potential capture of George Washington, who was due for a planned visit. The British readily accepted the terms. Then, on September 25th of 1780, everything came to a head. George Washington gazed out at the plateau on which rested what he believed to be the most important post in America. He was arriving later than expected, having sent his 2 aides on ahead, while he made a detour to inspect several redoubts. He was sorry to have missed breakfast with Arnold and his wife Peggy, but he'd instructed his aides to send his apologies for the delay. As he made his way across the river, George's brow furrowed in confusion. The fortifications were in a shocking state. Why had Arnold not seen to the reinforcements that he'd ordered? As Washington approached the stately-looking Robinson House that served as the headquarters of West Point, he was surprised to discover that General Arnold was nowhere to be found. His 2 aides, James McHenry and Samuel Shaw, informed him that they'd eaten the last half of their breakfast without the presence of General Arnold, who must have slipped out to attend to some matter. George nodded. It was strange, but not unreasonable to think that he might have been called away. But as time ticked by, Arnold did not make an appearance. Then came an intense knock at the door. George glanced at Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette, who accompanied him, wondering who it might be. They expected no one besides Arnold, and he certainly wouldn't knock. Washington was startled by the sudden entrance of a courier. The man looked winded, as though he'd ridden a great distance, then sprinted to the door. He pulled his carrier off his shoulder. "I have urgent news, General," he said. He procured several documents, handing them to George. As George unfolded them, his eyes scanned the words. His blood turned cold. The first papers contained detailed information in regards to West Point, the kind of information only the commander of the post could have known. He also recognized the handwriting. It was penned by Benedict Arnold. The next was a signed confession from Major John Andre. The pieces began falling together, and the conclusion was staggering. Benedict Arnold was a traitor. As they sat down at dinner that night, George and those who had accompanied him pondered the gravity of the situation. how close they'd come to ruin. But more than that, the sting of the betrayal hung around them. George's mind tossed with anger, betrayal, and despair. How could Arnold, his fighting general, have been capable of such a thing? He turned to look at Lafayette, who was watching him with some concern. "Arnold has betrayed us," George said. "Whom can we trust now?" The plot to surrender West Point and capture George Washington never did come to fruition. Why? Because God intervened. After Arnold took command of West Point, he subtly began dismantling the defenses, making it easy for the British to overtake it. He also continued his correspondence with John André. Then finally, at the end of September, Arnold had a late-night meeting with Major André along the banks of the Hudson River, where he gave the details necessary for West Point to be overtaken. The pieces were in place, ready to be set in motion. But as André returned to the ship that had brought him, he found that it was missing. The vessel had been discovered and bombarded by American artillery during the night and driven down shore. André was stranded. He had no choice but to cross by horse over American-occupied land. Joshua Het Smith, a Loyalist sympathizer, provided André with some civilian clothes. André also carried a pass signed by General Arnold himself, giving instructions to allow him to pass. Smith accompanied André up until the last 15 miles, which were through British territory. André thought he was home free, when 3 men suddenly jumped out of the woods, stopping him. These weren't men on a military commission. They were part of a small volunteer party looking to recover stolen goods. They were in the right place at the right time to make what Washington would later call a most providential interposition. John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wert caught André off guard. And André, looking at Paulding's Hessian coat, which to this day we don't really know why he had in the first place, mistook them for loyalists. André's story quickly changed, though, and he showed them his pass signed by General Arnold. Now this is the part that's so interesting. John sensed that something was wrong. It's frightening to think how easily he might have just let him go. But he made a switch-point choice that determined the fate of a nation. He insisted upon a search, and a thorough one at that, and they found the plans stowed away in André's socks. André began trying to bribe them with large sums of money, if they would just let him go. But John cried out, "No, by God, even if you give us 10,000 guineas, you won't stir a step." This began the chain of events that would expose Arnold's betrayal and his intent to surrender West Point. Was this a coincidence? Absolutely not. Not if you have faith in a divine orchestrator. Washington wrote of the 3 men that captured André, "I do not know the party that took Major André, but that they must have been, quote, men of great virtue," referring of course to their ability to resist André's money. In a message to his troops, Washington related these events and declared that the loss of West Point would have, quote, given the American cause a deadly wound, if not a fatal stab. Happily, the treason has been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to it affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the subject of divine protection. 3 weeks later, he reiterated this sentiment, saying, "In no instance since the commencement of the war has the interposition of Providence appeared more conspicuous than in the rescue of West Point from Arnold's villainous perfidy." I agree with Washington. It was a train of events that met a miraculous switch point. And these 3 virtually unknown heroes, John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wert, were rewarded the Fidelity Medal, an honor that was literally created for the occasion, and has never been given since. They stand in stark contrast to Arnold. They were lowly men who risked their very livelihoods to join the cause. They could not be moved by money or anything else to abandon their convictions, and we should remember them for that, because the fate of the United States of America hung on the brief encounter of 4 men on a road near Tarrytown. Miracles are so real. They happened then, and they happen now. So the question is, when have you seen miracles in your life? Because the road to freedom has never been an easy one. It is always wrought with trial, sacrifice, and betrayal. The ultimate example, of course, being the life of Jesus Christ, who paid the price for our freedom and was betrayed by someone who was closest to him. He too was betrayed for money, and that traitor had the gall to do it with a kiss. Do you realize that nations have been built or broken on the choices of individuals? Even the smallest choices are significant because they slowly pave our path. I don't imagine Benedict Arnold initially thought that he'd ever leave the American cause, and there were many factors that led to his betrayal. But after all of my studying, I have found what I believe to be the cause of his fall. Pride, the most dangerous fault. As C.S. Lewis reminds us, it was through pride that the devil became the devil. It was his wounded ego that led him to become the ultimate traitor of the cause of Christ. And you'll find that once a person leaves a cause, they will not be able to leave the cause alone. There is no neutral ground after betrayal. You will ultimately come to despise the cause that you once loved and actively fight against it. Arnold was able to make his escape when another courier apprised him of André's capture, and afterwards he did indeed take a place in the British Army. How strange it must have been to fight against the very people that he'd once called comrades. And things didn't end up being as glamorous on the other side as Arnold had hoped. He received only a portion of the price that he'd bargained for his betrayal, seeing as it had been unsuccessful. And he was far from heralded among the British. Eventually, he and Peggy moved back to England, but even there, he was not considered a hero. Instead, he was seen as a deserter, whose actions had led to the death of the heroic Major André. Benedict Arnold died in London, and was buried without military honors. It seems tragic, really, that his quest for honor and prominence resulted in the opposite. He was not praised by either side. Had he not defected, he would likely have been a prominent founding father, praised in our history books. But he's not. There were traitors in the early days of America, and there are traitors in our midst now. But we get to choose where we stand. I love in the New Testament where Christ calls us his friends. There's hardly a more tender title in my estimation, because love and loyalty are always synonymous. While even the best of us may falter in our loyalties from time to time, God's devotion toward us is constant. He is our undeviating friend and ally always. I hope that we can allow the truth of that to sink into our hearts and to ignite our faith. If you felt impacted by this episode, please like, share, and subscribe so that the fire of faith can continue to spread.